All right, folks, so we're going to start with moral life issues, and we'll start by giving a little introduction into what it means to say that something has being and how we make moral judgments based on that. I can't teach this without teaching about being. This is a whole field of philosophy called ontology that's obviously quite extensive. We're just going to just nip at it a little bit. So let's start by taking a few questions here. Is it moral to kill what is pictured behind this square? You guys are good. The last classes were shouting yeses and nos. They were really worrying me. No. All right. Well, it's a tomato plant, so you can kill a tomato plant. If you go up in my neighborhood and you kill other people's tomato plants, then you might die, but nonetheless. Is it moral to kill what is pictured behind this square? I'm going to take a shot.
Yes.
It depends.
Yes.
All right.
We don't know what's behind this.
Good thing Aaron's not here today. Mr. Butler, good thing Aaron's not here today.
Yeah. Aaron will go for it, right?
Okay.
No, you can't kill your neighbor's dog.
Why is it my neighbor's dog?
Well, I'm saying it's your neighbor's dog. Because does your neighbor have haystacks out in their yard?
What?
I had to qualify that because other people said, they want all the conditions when you could kill a dog. We're trying to keep it simple here. It's your neighbor's dog, You can't do it because it has too many wrinkles. Is it moral to kill what is pictured behind this square? No. Well, good for you. She's too cute. All right. Is it moral to kill what is pictured behind this square? Ian?
Is it Michael?
Is it no?
Is it Michael?
Ooh, that hurts.
Which Michael?
Bad enough? Oh, yeah, which Michael?
Williams.
All right. I think so. I don't think you want flies, right? They even sell fly swatters. Nobody's putting anybody in prison for killing flies. So you guys, either you're lacking energy or you just got it right away. We'll go with the second one. You can't determine the morality or the judgments of killing until you say, what is it? Until you answer the question, what is it? So judgments of immorality are based on being, what a thing is. So you were quite right to be hesitant and say, I don't know. It depends on what it is. This is the most basic questions that we're going to be asking and trying to answer, and usually the ones that society at large doesn't even address. All right, doesn't even address. Like, for instance, without me going into it, if we were to talk about, abortion, and somebody say, well, I believe it's a woman's right. What is the woman's right? To choose. The woman's right is to choose what? Whether or not to have an abortion. And an abortion is what? It's the taking of the fetus. And what is the fetus? I mean, you have to get to the bottom. What is it? All right? We have to answer that question before you can move on. So we're going to very simply define some of these words just so that we can use them in the argument. So for your purposes, we will say being is the substance, nature, or essence of an existing thing. Okay? It has to be an existing thing. You can't not be a thing, right? The substance, nature, or essence of an existing thing. We then will add a qualifier to it and say, then what is a human being? Because there's, all things have being, but we are separate from other beings. So a human being will be an individual embodied substance, and that means you have a body and soul. That's what embodied means, right? An individual embodied substance, body and soul, of a free and rational nature. Okay? So for us, a human being will be an individual embodied substance of a free and rational nature. So everybody here are human beings. Our natures are free and rational. This is what separates us from other beings. So if anybody wonders why does the Catholic Church set the human person as the ultimate and of all creation, It's because there is no other being that has a free and rational nature, and we share that imaging with God. All right. They all have some level of, rationality, but not in the same sense that we would use it for us. Okay, so that's really nothing controversial. This is where we start to have some discussions and arguments, if you want to say. So before I talk about personhood per se, let's use the etymology. Now, etymology is not perfect. Sometimes it's hard to really determine where the word came from. But this is a good stab at it. In the Latin, there's the word personare, right? So it sounds through, the sounding through. That's not a half bad guess at the etymology. So personare is the Latin meaning sounding through. Persona, which is the word we're familiar with, originally came from, it referred to the mask Greeks wore in theater, which is why in theater you still see like mask or as an icon. So they would assume different persona when they put on a different mask. So you knew which person. That's where it originally came from. Philosophy in the Catholic Church grabbed onto this and said this is perfect for what we need to do and what we need to say. Okay? So what this means then is we're going to start out with an assertion that there are no human beings who are not persons. All right? All human beings are persons. All individual embodied substances are persons. Now why? Because we can't envision.
Anthony Arroyo, please report to main office.
We can't envision humans who are not persons. The tragedies in our world, in the history of man, has been one group referring to another group as non-persons. All right?
Could you repeat the last one?
Here?
Yeah.
We're talking about persona originally refers to the mask that the Greeks would wear in theater. They would assume different personas manifested in their mask, or at least the mask would give us the idea that's manifested. Okay, so if there are no human beings that are not persons, is it true that do you think there are persons who are not human beings? Thinking in Catholic theology, what persons can there be that are not human beings? Well, angels, absolutely. Demons, right? Yeah, the good and the bad.
Holy Spirit.
Yeah, well, yeah, the triune persons, 3 persons in one God, right? So those are all persons. And if by chance there is alien life somewhere, we would assume that they too are persons, all right? So there are persons who may not be humans, but there are no humans that are not persons. And the only reason is because we're not going to apply criteria to one group and not the other. Because it's always going to be the powerful over the weak, and it's always going to be the rich over the poor. So, what else we will assert is that personhood cannot be earned, and it cannot be forfeited. You cannot earn personhood, and you cannot forfeit your personhood. So it didn't matter if you fed 10,000 people with the money that you made from an invention. It does not make you a true person. It also doesn't mean that if you happen to kill 15 or 20 people in a murdering spree, that you have lost your personhood. And don't interpret that as, well, then what, saying not to punish them. No, we're not talking about that. It's a separate issue. But a person never loses or gains their personhood. If you're made in the image of God, you're made in His image, you're a rational and free embodied individual, and you have the right of personhood. Okay? Now, yes?
So then would an atheist person think that they already have their personhood?
Well, it depends. Now, if they're inept in this, they might struggle depending. Let me put it this way. They would have to recognize personhood, but they're going to have to come up with criteria. So I'll give you a concrete example. Peter Singer, he's the ethicist at Princeton University. He says that you don't really become a person until you exhibit a self-consciousness, like a self-awareness. And that's typically 5 to 6 months of age. So not only is he okay with abortion, he's okay with killing a child ethically up until that point. Okay, now what is sick about that is that, we're talking about infanticide. What's good about it, if you want to say anything, is that he's consistent. All right, and I'll talk about why. So you would have to have criteria for personhood. What we're trying to say is anybody who's ever going to come up with criteria, it's always going to benefit them, and it's always going to be the powerful, right? It's always going to be people that have less or have no say. They're the ones that then get marked as non-persons. And the entire history of our humanity is peppered with one group enslaving another or utilizing another for themselves instrumentally because they don't see them as persons, right? So we're just going to say there can be none. All right, so I'm going to demonstrate this to you now, but I need, what I'll do is I'm going to walk through this, what I call like a little flow chart, and then I'm going to explain it a little more clearly once we're all said and done. So here would be our issues. If we believe that a human person is a free and rational being, what about a person that's severely disabled? My wife, when she was in grade school, one of her friends was a very intelligent, lovely young girl. She was a horseman. She rode horses. She fell off her horse, hit her head the wrong way, and was in special education throughout the rest of her education, and still took necessary care from the parents. Right? Could never live on their own. Did she lose her personhood? She doesn't really have rationality in the way we would see it, okay? Or what about an unborn person? We're going to try to say that a 2-week-old is rational and free in the same way Ian is? People are going to say, no, it doesn't make any sense. What about somebody who loses it, right? They fall into a coma, and they're being kept alive. Do they still exhibit rationality and freedom? Even some of the words in the past to describe their state, it's terrible, but they would say vegetables, right? A persistent vegetative state. So they would almost depersonalize that individual. Right? So we have to address that. So what we're going to say before I get into a little flow chart with you is I'm going to talk to you about 2 things, act and potency, okay? Because this really is the best way to explain it to you and have you understand it. When aspects proper to a person, rationality and freedom, when they're present, we can say that they're actual. Right? So in Ian, rationality and freedom have been actualized. Nobody's going to disagree with that. All right? So an act is the perfection of a thing. So rationality and freedom have been perfected in Ian. All right? They've been brought to perfection. And don't think like perfect, like, it's the highest. That's not what we're using it here. We're talking about, they have been actualized and they're evident to us. All right? So the perfection of a thing. Conversely, when aspects proper to a person are not present, we can say that they're in potential. So when Ian was 2 weeks old, we wouldn't say that he was exhibiting actualizing rationality and freedom, but they were there in their potency. Okay, they were there in his potency. They then became actualized. So potentiality is the power of a thing, right? It's the power of a thing. So in a young person, say 2 weeks old, the power of rationality and freedom are present. They have not yet been actualized. All right, that sets the stage for what I'm going to show you next. Now, what I'm going to show you next, by the way, let me back up. This generation is the most pro-life generation since Roe v. Wade. Now, why is that? I think because of science and reason. The arguments are just getting harder and harder on the other side, all right? Which is why you see an individual like Sanger having to at least be legitimate and say, well, I believe it goes to 5 or 6 months old. Not every year, but over the course of the years of me teaching this, students have come to me on the side and said, I was for abortion until that class. I don't know how you get around the argument on the next slide. I don't know how you do it. That doesn't mean that there isn't arguments. I just don't know what those arguments would be.
What are those 2, like?
Here?
Yeah.
A thing. Perfection of a thing and the power of a thing. So an act is the perfection of a thing, and a potentiality is the power of a thing. All right. So what we're going to look at is, does an essence change? So if I'm holding an acorn in my hand, That's its actuality. But there's potency in that acorn, right? It's a seed. So its potentiality is a sapling. It can become a sapling. That's what's next, all right? That's its future. It's not a possibility. It's its future. I mean, an acorn, if somebody says, well, but we could, the seed may never get planted. No. Under the normal course of events, an acorn is going to become a sapling. It's going to break through the surface of the ground, and we'll call it a sapling. It's not going to become a cherry tree. It's not going to become a giraffe. That's what it is, all right? So it's a potential sapling. When it does become a sapling, we will now say, for all intents and purposes, that aspect of it has been actualized. The potentiality of it is to become a tree. There's really no potentiality after that, because after the tree, we would say death, and you lose that loss of being, okay? So the acorn is actualized, but it's a potential sapling. When it becomes a sapling, that has been actualized, it's a potential tree, and when it becomes a tree, that has been actualized, all right? Simple enough. You could see, actuality moves in this direction, and the thing before it is this potency, right? So even though before it was a tree, it contained that potency, that potentiality. We'll say the same thing here with a fetus. A fetus, that's its actuality. What is its potential? Well, one is as far as the stages go, is a toddler, all right? So if somebody starts making the argument, well, it's a potential human being, well, stop. I'm sorry, what is it? A potential human being. So what are the other potentials? I mean, what is it now? If it's a potential human being, could you say what it is now? Is it undifferentiated cells? I mean, you don't do that with an acorn, right? You don't go to, wherever you might buy your seeds, go to Esmond Shades and say, I need, 20 packets of seeds. What kind of seeds? Well, just give them to me and I'll determine what they become. No, they already contain a nature. That's already been determined. Well, but if I buy a pumpkin seed, it's a possible pumpkin. No, its future is a pumpkin. It's not a possible pumpkin anymore than it's a possible grape or a possible watermelon. It's already contains a nature. So when the toddler has been actualized as a stage, it still has the potentiality to become adult, and then you can guess from that point it becomes the actual adult. Now what does this say? This says that as far as the acorn is concerned, its nature has remained oak. It's always been oak. It has been nothing else. The acorn was not going to become a giraffe. The acorn was not going to become a watermelon. It was always oak. It was potential. Whatever we understand about the nature of oak, it existed in all three of these. Okay? Similarly, whatever we understand in the fetus, the toddler, and adult, its nature is a human. It's not, when you hear a politician say, when we'll talk about this tomorrow, I don't know when life begins. You just need to go talk to a biology teacher. That's a done deal. Nobody's arguing that anymore. If they are, they're ignorant. But somebody might say, well, okay, it's a life, but is it a human life? It's going to become a human life. You have to ask the question, what is it now? It's not undifferentiated cells that one day might become something, like stem cells. You might have a cell that can become an organ, blood. That's a different story. But you're not going to have any unborn child that's going to be anything else. Well, it's a possible adult. No, that's its future. There's no other possibilities. Okay, that's its future. It never loses the nature of human. So this is how, from the moment of conception to the moment of natural death, we can assert, you notice nothing here, there's no biblical phrases, there's no mentions of Jesus or God here, right? From conception to natural death, we have no other choice but to call it a human being. And if you want to make the argument that it's a human being but not a person, what criteria are you using? By the way, here's what our country's criteria is, outside of the womb. The minute, not the body, the head. The minute the head is outside of the womb, it becomes a person. If the head's inside the womb, it's not a person. If it comes out of the womb, it's a person. I want you to make your own judgments on that and tell me if that even sounds reasonable. By the way, I can't even show like anything. It wasn't even a terribly graphic movie, but I showed something about abortion. I had a kid pass out, and people were getting disturbed over it because a partial birth abortion is based on the premise that you're not a person until you come out of the womb. So they literally will turn the child around and deliver everything except the head. They'll leave that in the vaginal cavity, and they could still then abort because it's not a person. Now, you have to put that together if that makes any sense to you, but that's the law of our land, all right? So when you have somebody like Peter Sanger, who says that you can end a child's life, or should be able to end a child's life to 5 or 6 months, if you have some sort of like, reflex to that as it being like unbearable, all he's saying is it's ridiculous to say what everybody else is saying, that it's a person when it's out of the womb. He says if we're going to say what makes it a person, let's say it's self-aware, and it's not self-aware because its head comes out of the womb, it's self-aware at 5 or 6 months. So as disturbing as that is to some, he's consistent. The people who say it's a person when it comes out of the womb aren't even being, they're either just sticking to an ideology or they have a dull mind and can't understand this, all right? So the church just steps in and says, that's it. You're a human, you're a person. We're not going to be in the business of saying person, non-person. We're not going to set up criteria, all right? So what we see here is that the accidents change, right? Because we're not saying that an embryo is the same exact look as a person, right? We understand that there's potentialities, other things have not been actualized, but the accidents have changed, not the essence or the substance, not the essence has not changed. So think back to when I did essence and accidents with the Eucharist. Remember but I said you could put an apple out on the sidewalk and everybody walked by, and if I say, what is that? You'd say it's an apple. And as the apple started to rot and decay, you would then add an adjective and say it's a rotten apple. And if somebody stepped on it, you said it's a squished apple. But as long as you can identify that as an apple or pieces of apples, you would still call it an apple. When the accidents were no longer there, they would lose its being. So what we're saying here is we understand that the accidents change from the acorn to the sapling of the tree. We get that. We know it doesn't look the same. We understand the accidents change from the fetus, even going down to an embryo, to a toddler, to an adult. We get that. And we get that this person is exhibiting rationality and freedom that an embryo can't. We get that too. All we're saying is it's proper to its nature. It hasn't been actualized. The nature never changes. You can't call it something else. You have to invent your own metaphysics if you want to try to start doing that. But in political discourse, this is what we're stuck with. All right? Now, just so we can be certain that there is no distinction between divine revelation and natural revelation. Okay, so what I just showed you in the previous 2 slides was strictly from natural revelation. If I were talking to a group who did not embrace any Christian faith, that was how I'd make my argument. And not ironically, but I guess coincidentally, the handful of students that have come to me over the years have been either outside of the Christian faith or atheists and said, I've changed my mind. Why? And they usually were the brighter ones because they say, I don't know how you get around that argument. I said, the church has been saying all along. All right? But that being said, human life is sacred because from its beginning, says the Catechism, man remains in a special relationship with his Creator. Man is in a special relationship with his Creator. All I'm showing you here is how biblical revelation affirms everything I just told you without trying to make, the philosophical argument. And life in the Trinity is the sole end of the human person. So we are made in love for love to return to his love. Human life is sacred from its beginning. Man is part of the creative process, okay? Which tells us then, like here's Genesis 4:1. I mean, sometimes you read a part of Scripture or a quote, and it's either too familiar or we just say, we don't even think about it because we don't want to question it or we have a lot of apathy towards it. Isn't that an odd way? Have you known anybody that's having a baby and they said, I've produced a man with the help of the Lord? No. They've had conjugal relations. She's pregnant. That's how we talk. Why would Revelation say this? Well, because of the soul. I have 3 daughters. I am not the origins of their souls. But neither do I simply lay claims to their bodies. I don't walk around and they say, those are your kids. Well, their bodies are. I'm not the parent of the soul, I'm the parent of their bodies. No, because we understand the incarnate being, the whole person is there. So, me and my wife made 3 children with the help of the Lord. All right? And interestingly enough, I wish we had more time to go on and on, because neuroscience, I was reading this article on the neuroscience, he was an atheist, who he himself converted just by what he experienced and what he's been finding. In other words, if you're a materialist, right, and you say that your brain is your mind, we would disagree. Your brain is the organ, okay? So the mind's immaterial. And if you say, well, no, we're really just a measure of chemicals and electrical impulses, well, then you've given up your free will, whether you've come to that conclusion or not, okay? So I produced a man with the help of the Lord. That was my attempt at being funny. Yes?
What is after life and eternity is the soul?
Is the sole end of man. That's your goal, your object, your end. All right. Then we see similar phrases in both Psalms and Jeremiah. You formed my inmost being, you've knit me in the womb. And in Jeremiah, before I formed you, I knew you in the womb. So you'll see biblical references like this as appeal to the unborn child being a human person. In other words, if God knew them when they were being formed, then he doesn't know a thing. He knows a person. And I think it's a pretty good revelation argument. In other words, you're destroying something that God is creating. And you're destroying something that you cannot have created on your own. And all the, this, by the way, Wednesday and Thursday I'll talk about ethical systems. And then the entire fourth quarter, I'll let you guys pick what topics you'd like to go over. But if we had more time to spend that, if we do get into like life issues like euthanasia, IVF, and such, for people to make the argument, well, the baby's a part of the mother, that's biologically false. There's arguments that, well, it's called the violin, an expert violinist is dying, and they bring in a hostage and hook the person up to them, and that person's keeping them alive. Do they have any ethical reason to continue to offer their body to keep the other person alive? And then use those for abortion arguments. I mean, you might already be thinking that that's not even a parallel, right? But very deep thinking people have tried to make these arguments. If we get into the life issues, we could talk more about those. This is not an easy sentence. Your body's a temple. You're not your own. You become a Christian, you've given your body over for his service, whatever that might be. Your body is not your own. Apply this to marriage, because it is applied to marriage. A woman's body is her husband's. A husband's body is his wife's. Not for domination, for total submission. In other words, if that's her body, I'm entrusted to it as a steward, and I can't do anything to diminish that person's humanity. Could you imagine if a husband and wife understood that? Do you think anybody get divorced with knowing that? It wouldn't happen, right? It wouldn't happen. But they sound like, what do I say, fanciful precepts. Carawaltia, this is Pope John Paul II. Does anybody know that was his name, by the way? Okay, you did. Anybody else? Okay, Carawaltia. He was what we call the philosopher pope. Pope Benedict XVI was probably one of the smartest theologians to sit in that throne. And that's not just because he happens to live in our time. The guy's an intellectual giant theologically. Carawaltia was a philosopher. And he was into phenomenology and personalism. We could talk about that sometime if we get into human sexuality. He says 2 elements of man. We're talking about personhood. He said, first of all, personhood, it is not contingent upon another's criteria. Personhood is not contingent upon another's criteria. And you can imagine why. What criteria are you going to use? So we're going to say, rather than develop criteria, we're going to say it's nothing. You can't earn it. You can't lose it. It comes from your nature. So it's contingent upon another's criteria. And the second point about personhood is it is not based upon one's productivity. It is not based upon one's productivity. You are not, or let's put it this way, your human personhood is not determined by how much you offer. it's something young. Now, before we're done, let me just share one little thing. When I was in parochial school, you know, it's funny, they call it the learning moments. You remember things that were never points the teacher was trying to make. They were like little side stories. So I remember Sister Leocadia telling us a story, and I don't know if it was ever true, about Native Americans and how once you were old, at least in one tribe, when you hit a certain age, they would accept death because they knew at this point I was only a burden to the community. Have a seat, have a seat. I was a burden to the community, I am not really contributing. So she told us a story about how a father and his young son took the grandfather out on a sled, and they would do it in the winter, because the person would freeze to death relatively soon, and they say that once you get past the chill, it's a peaceful death. So they took the grandfather out, and they set him on the sled to be exposed. And on the way back, the young person asked his father, should we go back and get the sled? And he says, no, we'll let it there with grandfather. And he says, well, what am I going to use when it's time for me to bring you? And it kind of convicted the dad, so he went back and took the grandfather back and saw that there was worth within him, not in how utilizing the utility of him in the tribe. That stuck with me. Karawati is saying the same thing. All right, it's not based on anything. We can't use criteria to identify this. Anything?
Okey dokes.